The office was quiet, too quiet for a room filled with men and women in uniform. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a pale reminder of routine, though nothing about this moment was routine. At the long mahogany table, Admiral Foster tapped his pen against the folder before him, staring at the words as if his eyes could force them to change. They would not. The report was final. Helicopter down. No survivors expected. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitfield, presumed killed in action. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His voice, when it came, was gravel. Draft the letters. Around him, staff officers shifted uncomfortably. Writing condolence letters was a duty they had performed before, but there was something different this time. Sarah wasn't just another name in a casualty report. She was the kind of officer who left an impression, sharp, unyielding, and respected in every room she entered. She'd trained half the men at the base, pushed them harder than they thought possible, and earned their loyalty not by rank, but by presence. And now they were supposed to put her life into words that fit neatly on one sheet of official stationery. Lieutenant Harris, the aide assigned to casualties, pulled a blank page from his folder. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted it under the lamp's glow. He had written letters before to parents who lost sons, to wives who lost husbands, but never to the family of someone like Sarah. He dipped his pen, stared at the page, and began, "It is with profound regret that I inform you." The words were clinical, almost rehearsed, the same lines that had been written for decades. They sounded respectful, but they lacked Sarah's fire, her defiance of everything ordinary. How could this letter, this hollow arrangement of ink, capture the woman who once ran 20 miles on a broken ankle, just to prove to her men that pain was weakness leaving the body? Harris stopped writing. He looked up, his eyes heavy. "Sir," he whispered, "shouldn't we wait for confirmation?" The Admiral's jaw tightened. "Confirmation?" he asked sharply. The helicopter exploded in a gorge. No beacon, no comes. "You think she crawled out of that fireball?" "I don't know," Harris admitted, voice low. "But with all due respect, sir, if anyone could, it'd be her." The words hung in the air. Nobody challenged them, but nobody agreed either. Reality in war was cold, and hope had a cruel habit of breaking hearts twice. The Admiral finally muttered, "Write the letters. Families deserve closure." At the base overseas, the atmosphere was heavy. Word traveled faster than orders, carried in whispers across the compound. Soldiers passing in the mess hall spoke quietly, shaking their heads. Some cursed fate under their breath. Others stared into their trays of food without appetite. Captain Ruiz, one of Sarah's closest colleagues, sat alone at a corner table. He had fought alongside her in Iraq, trained under her leadership in Coronado, and had come to respect her as the kind of commander who demanded nothing less than excellence because she demanded the same of herself. When a young corporal slid into the seat across from him, Ruiz didn't look up. "They say she's gone," the corporal said, his voice uncertain, like he wanted someone to correct him. Ruiz finally met his eyes. "That's what the paper says," he replied flatly. "You don't believe it?" Ruiz leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He wanted to say no. He wanted to cling to the idea that Sarah was unbreakable. But he had seen helicopters fall. He had seen the wreckage. Few things were crueler than false hope. "Belief doesn't change facts," Ruiz said quietly. "Eat your food, soldier." The corporal lowered his head. But Ruiz's own heart twisted. Because in the back of his mind, no matter how many times he told himself it was over, another voice whispered, if anyone could survive, it'd be her. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet suburban home in Virginia, Sarah's mother folded laundry when the knock came at her door. It was a sharp, deliberate knock, the kind that always made her chest seize. because mothers of service members knew that knock. When she opened the door, 2 officers stood there in dress uniforms. One held a letter. The other held a folded flag. Her knees buckled before a word was spoken. Back in the command office, Harris finished the final signature. He stacked the condolence letters neatly, his hands steady now, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. He pushed the stack toward the Admiral, who gave them one last glance before sealing them. "That will be all," the Admiral said, voice heavy with finality. Harris gathered his papers and left. But as he walked the dim hallway, a strange thought gnawed at him. Somewhere, somehow, Sarah Whitfield might still be out there. It was unlikely. It was irrational. But he couldn't kill the thought. And far away, in the cold shadows of the mountains, Sarah Whitfield was very much alive. Smoke rose from the wreckage behind her, curling into the dawn sky. Her uniform was torn, her face smeared with blood and dirt. Every muscle ached. Her ears still rang from the explosion. But when she looked down at Ramirez, gasping for air with blood soaking his chest, and Hale, unconscious with his leg bent at a sickening angle, she felt only one thing: determination. She tightened the straps of the makeshift bandages, ignoring the sting in her own wounds. She checked her pistol, the last weapon she had, and scanned the ridges for movement. She knew command believed she was gone. She knew the letters were probably already written, folded neatly into envelopes that would break her family's heart. But she didn't care, because Sarah Whitfield wasn't finished. And as long as the men beside her still breathed, neither were they. The mountain air was thin, sharp against the lungs, carrying the distant scent of smoke and pine. At nearly 9,000 feet, even breathing felt like labor. But Sarah Whitfield wasn't thinking about oxygen. Her mind was locked on the objective. She crouched low at the edge of a rocky ridge, peering through her night vision goggles. Below, nestled in the shadow of the cliffs, a compound flickered with faint light. Satellite images had marked it weeks ago, a suspected enemy stronghold, supply cache, and safe house for high-value targets. "Target confirmed," whispered Chief Ramirez beside her, his voice steady despite the chill. Sarah gave a sharp nod. Behind her, the rest of the SEAL team waited in silence. Weapons ready, nerves taut but trained. Every man knew the risks. They'd infiltrated hostile territory before, but tonight felt different. There was an edge to the silence, as if the mountains themselves held their breath. "Move," Sarah ordered, her tone clipped, no room for hesitation. The team flowed down the ridge like shadows, boots crunching against loose rock, weapons scanning. They approached the compound perimeter, the world reduced to heartbeats and the faint creak of gear. Then the first shot cracked. The bullet snapped past Sarah's ear, embedding itself into the stone wall beside her. For a fraction of a second, time froze. Then chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes burst from the compound, lighting up the darkness like strobe lights. Enemy fighters poured from hidden bunkers, rifles blazing. "Ambush!" Ramirez shouted, returning fire. Sarah hit the ground, rolling behind a boulder, her rifle already raised. She squeezed the trigger, sending a burst into the enemy line. One fighter dropped. Another took his place. The mountains roared with gunfire. "Fall back." They knew we were coming. Sarah yelled. But retreat was easier said than done. The team was pinned from 2 sides, rounds sparking against the rocks. Holly screamed as a bullet tore through his leg, collapsing in the dirt. 2 other SEALs fired blindly to cover him, but the enemy pressed harder. Too many, too fast. "Where the hell is extraction?" Ramirez barked into the comms. "Birds inbound," came the pilot's strained voice. 2 minutes. 2 minutes felt like forever. Sarah crawled to Hale, dragging him behind cover, blood pumping from his thigh. "Stay with me," she snapped, cinching a tourniquet tight until his scream echoed through the canyon. "You're not dying tonight." The thrum of helicopter blades filled the air, a distant salvation. Sarah looked up, hope flickering, then died as she saw the streak of fire cut through the night sky. A surface-to-air missile. It hit the chopper square in the belly. The explosion was deafening, fireball illuminating the cliffs, raining debris over the gorge. The bird spun violently before crashing into the valley floor, smoke billowing. "Jesus Christ," Ramirez muttered, eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah's heart pounded. Extraction was gone. Backup was gone. And the enemy was closing in. "We move," she ordered, her voice slicing through the panic. "North Ridge, now." The team scrambled, dragging Halle, firing into the darkness to keep the enemy at bay. Sarah laid down bursts of suppressive fire, her rifle barrel glowing hot, sweat dripping into her eyes. She refused to look back at the burning wreckage. If she did, she might break. As they scrambled up the slope, another explosion rocked the ground. Mortar fire. The enemy was not only waiting for them, they were driving them into a kill zone. Sarah's instincts screamed. This wasn't bad luck. This was betrayal. Someone had fed the enemy their plan. But she had no time to dwell. Another mortar shell burst nearby, throwing her off her feet. Her helmet slammed into the rocks. Stars filled her vision. "Commander." Ramirez's voice echoed through the ringing in her ears. She pushed herself up, head spinning, just in time to see another blast tear through the team. 2 men went down, unmoving. The rest scattered, crawling for cover. Sarah's lungs burned. Her throat tasted of ash and blood. But her mind was clear. If she didn't act, they were finished. She grabbed Ramirez by the vest, hauling him back into position. "We hold them here," she barked. "We don't break." Together, they returned fire, cutting down fighters as they surged forward. For a moment, it seemed possible maybe they could claw their way out. Then the ridge above them exploded. Rocks rained down, smoke swallowed the night, and Sarah felt the ground vanish beneath her. She fell, tumbling, weightless for a horrifying second, before slamming into hard earth. Pain exploded in her side. Her rifle was gone. Her ears rang. Through the haze, she glimpsed the wreckage of the helicopter below, burning like a beacon of defeat. And beside her, barely breathing, lay Ramirez and Halle. Everyone else was gone. For a long moment, Sarah lay still, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Every instinct told her it was over. Command would never find them. The enemy would. But then Ramirez stirred, coughing blood, and Halle whimpered through clenched teeth. Sarah forced herself upright, ignoring the agony in her ribs. She crawled to them, checked their pulses, tightened their bandages. They were broken, but alive. Her mind sharpened. She knew what this meant. They weren't being rescued. They weren't being saved. From here on, survival was on her shoulders alone. Above the valley, enemy shouts echoed, searching the wreckage, hunting for survivors. Sarah clenched her jaw, dragging the men deeper into the shadows of a ravine. She pressed her back to the stone, listening as boots crunched closer. Her hand found the pistol at her belt, the only weapon she had left. She checked the magazine. 1 clip, not enough. She looked at Ramirez and Hall, both barely conscious. She thought of Command already sealing their fates in black ink, condolence letters on desks far from here. Not yet, not like this. Sarah Whitfield inhaled sharply, steadying her racing heart. The mission was over, but her war was just beginning. The night was mercilessly quiet after the storm of fire. Smoke from the downed helicopter still curled into the mountain air, a grim beacon that said, This is where they died. Sarah Whitfield pressed her back against the jagged wall of the ravine, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. Every bone in her body ached, every muscle screamed. Blood ran down her arm from a cut she hadn't even felt yet. But none of that mattered, not compared to the sight in front of her. Chief Ramirez was sprawled on the ground, his uniform dark with blood. His breaths were shallow, each one a rattling protest against death. Petty Officer Hall lay a few feet away, pale and drenched in sweat, his leg bent at an angle no human bone was meant to take. For a long moment, Sarah just stared at them, mind racing. 2 wounded men, no radio, no supplies beyond what she could scavenge from the wreck. Enemy patrols sweeping the valley, and no one coming for them. Command had already written them off. She knew it in her bones. Somewhere, an admiral was signing her death notice. Somewhere, her mother was about to open the door to 2 officers in dress blues. She clenched her jaw. Not yet. Not while they're still breathing. Sarah crawled to Ramirez first. She tore open his vest, her fingers working with mechanical precision despite the tremor in her hands. A deep chest wound, bleeding heavily. She ripped strips from her own undershirt, packing the wound, pressing until Ramirez groaned in pain. "Stay with me, Chief," she whispered, her voice low, commanding. "I need you to breathe." "That's an order." His eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused. He tried to speak, but blood bubbled at his lips. She pressed harder, refusing to let panic in. Next, she moved to Halle. His leg was mangled, bone visible through torn flesh. The sight would have broken most soldiers. Sarah didn't allow herself to react. She scavenged a piece of twisted helicopter metal, aligning it against his leg, then lashed it tight with strips of webbing. Halle screamed even in unconsciousness, the sound echoing in the gorge. Sarah silenced, him with a hand over his mouth, glancing sharply at the ridge above. Voices. Enemy fighters shouting in a language she didn't understand, their torches bobbing along the cliffs. Sarah's pulse spiked. They were searching. They'd comb the wreck soon, and if they found her here, it was over. She looked at her men. Moving them now was madness, but staying was death. Decision made, she dragged Ramirez first, hooking her arms under his shoulders, pulling with every ounce of strength. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but inch by inch, she moved him deeper into the ravine. She went back for Howe, lifting him enough to sling his arm over her shoulder. He was heavier than he looked. His dead weight pressed down on her, but she carried him anyway. By the time she had them both concealed beneath an outcropping, sweat drenched her uniform. Her arms shook uncontrollably. She slumped against the stone, chest heaving. Above, flashlights swept across the wreckage. Boots crunched, voices shouted. Sarah held her breath, pistol clenched tight in her hand. One wrong sound, and they'd be discovered. Minutes stretched into eternity. At last the voices faded. The patrol moved on, leaving only the crackle of burning metal behind. Sarah exhaled slowly, her hand shaking as she lowered the pistol. She had bought them time, nothing more. The hours that followed blurred together. Sarah worked in silence, tending to Ramirez and Halle with the limited tools she had, scraps of fabric, strips of metal, whatever could be repurposed into bandages and splints. She rationed what little water they had salvaged from a dented canteen, wetting their lips, forcing them to swallow. Ramirez slipped in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he whispered apologies, calling himself dead weight, begging her to leave him behind. "Shut up, Chief," Sarah muttered each time, her voice firm, almost harsh. "You're not going anywhere." "Not on my watch." Halle didn't speak. He drifted in fevered dreams, mumbling nonsense, eyes fluttering. Sarah kept a hand on his chest when he shook, grounding him, refusing to let him drift too far. By dawn, Exhaustion gnawed at her. She hadn't slept. Her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant accepting they were already dead. She wouldn't. When the sun rose, Sarah climbed to the ridge alone, scanning the valley. The compound they tried to assault was still there, crawling with fighters. Too many. She couldn't risk going back. North, the mountains stretched for miles, jagged and cruel. Somewhere beyond them, maybe days away, was friendly ground. It was suicide to attempt the trek with 2 wounded men. But what was the alternative? Wait here until the enemy found them? Wait until Ramirez bled out and Hale's fever took him? She clenched her fists. There was no alternative. By mid-morning, Sarah had fashioned a crude stretcher from branches and parachute fabric torn from the wreck. She strapped Ramirez onto it, tightening the knots until they held. Then she shouldered the straps and lifted. The weight nearly buckled her knees. But she gritted her teeth and forced one step, then another. Hale limped beside her, his arms slung around her shoulders, each step a battle. She half carried, half dragged him, refusing to stop even when her legs trembled. They moved slowly, painfully, but they moved. Every sound in the wilderness became a threat. Every shadow between the trees might conceal an enemy. Sarah kept her pistol close, eyes scanning constantly. She avoided ridgelines, sticking to the valleys, moving at a pace just fast enough to outdistance death. At night, she built no fires. She wrapped her men in pieces of canvas, pressing close to share body heat. Sleep came in fragments, stolen minutes with her head against the cold ground, ears always straining for footsteps. Each dawn, she rose, lifted the stretcher again, and marched. By the 3rd day, Ramirez's fever worsened. His skin burned, his body shaking with chills. Sarah forced him to drink water, whispering encouragement in his ear. "Don't you dare check out on me, Chief. You've survived worse. Remember Panama? You told me that story a dozen times. Survive this, and I'll let you tell it a dozen more." His lips cracked into the faintest smile before he slipped back into unconsciousness. Hale, meanwhile, grew quieter. His pain was relentless, but he clenched his jaw and bore it, watching Sarah with something between awe and guilt. "You should have left us," he croaked once, his voice hoarse. Sarah stopped, glaring at him. "Say that again, and I'll knock your teeth out." "I mean it," Hale whispered. "You'd move faster alone. You'd have a chance." Sarah leaned down until her face was inches from his. Her voice was steel. "Listen to me, sailor. I don't leave my men. Ever? You hear me? You breathe, you walk, you fight. That's your only job." Hale swallowed, nodding weakly. That night, as she sat awake with the pistol in her lap, Sarah let herself think of home for the first time. She imagined her mother, the smell of her kitchen, the warmth of her embrace. She imagined the knock at the door, the folded flag, the letter filled with empty words. Her jaw tightened. She would not let that letter be the last word of her story. Somewhere beyond these mountains, life still waited. She would carry her men there if it killed her. Because until her last breath, Sarah Whitfield refused to be a ghost. The mountains did not forgive. Every step Sarah Whitfield took was a battle against the jagged stone that tore her boots apart, against the thin air that burned her lungs, and against the cruel weight of Ramirez on the stretcher strapped across her shoulders. Behind her, Hale limped, teeth clenched so hard his jaw muscles stood out in ridges, leaning on her arm whenever his broken leg gave way. They were moving at a crawl, but they were moving. By day, the sun beat down on the ridges, making the rock until it radiated heat like a furnace. By night, the cold cut through flesh and bone, a bitter reminder that survival was never guaranteed here. Sarah had stopped worrying about comfort. Her entire world was reduced to one mantra: One more step. One more ridge. One more day. On the 5th day, enemy patrols swept through the valley. Sarah saw them first from a rocky ledge, 6 fighters with rifles slung across their shoulders, scanning the terrain below. She shoved Ramirez's stretcher behind a cluster of boulders, pulling Halle down beside him. Her hand pressed against his chest in warning. Don't move. Don't breathe loud. The patrol passed close. Close enough that Sarah could see the dirt on their boots, hear their laughter echo in the canyon. One man stopped, crouched near the rocks. He bent down, scanning the ground. Sarah's heart hammered. Her hand closed around the pistol at her hip. If he took one more step, she'd have to shoot, and the gunfire would bring the rest down on them. The fighter straightened suddenly, muttering something to his comrade, then spat into the dirt and walked on. Within minutes, the patrol vanished into the ridgeline. Only then did Sarah allow herself to breathe. She looked back at Ramirez and Hall. Both were pale, silent, eyes wide with fear. She forced a small smile. See? Easy. They never knew we were here. Halle snorted softly, the closest thing to a laugh he could manage. Ramirez, too weak to speak, simply blinked once in acknowledgement. But Sarah's mind churned. That was too close. The longer they stayed in these valleys, the greater the chance of discovery. They had to move faster, even if it killed her. 2 more days blurred into each other. Sarah hauled Ramirez's stretcher up a slope so steep it felt like climbing a wall, her boots slipping on loose shale, every pull threatening to rip her shoulders from their sockets. Halle gritted his teeth, helping when he could, but his body betrayed him more often than not. At the summit, Sarah collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. She tasted blood in the back of her throat. Her vision swam. But then Ramirez coughed weakly, and Halle muttered, "We're still alive." "Ma'am." Sarah pushed herself upright, wiping sweat from her brow. "Damn right we are," she said. "And we're going to stay that way." The nights were the hardest. Without fire, the cold seeped into their bones. Sarah wrapped Ramirez and Hall in torn parachute silk and pressed herself against them, her body heat the only barrier against the freezing air. Sleep was shallow, broken by the distant sound of wolves or the imagined crunch of boots on gravel. One night, as she sat awake with her pistol balanced across her knees, Halle stirred beside her. "You ever think, maybe we won't make it?" he asked softly, his voice cracking. Sarah looked at him, eyes sharp in the moonlight. "Every damn minute," she admitted. "But thinking it doesn't mean it's true. What matters is what we do next. And right now, what we do is survive." Halle nodded, swallowing hard. For the first time, he believed her. On the 10th day, Sarah's strength nearly failed her. They were crossing a narrow pass, the drop on either side sheer and merciless. Halfway across, Ramirez stirred on the stretcher, thrashing in fever. The sudden shift threw Sarah off balance. Her foot slipped, gravel skittering over the edge. For one terrifying second, she teetered with Ramirez's full weight, dragging her down. Halle shouted her name, reaching for her arm. With a roar of effort, Sarah slammed her knee into the ground, anchoring herself. The stretcher tilted dangerously, Ramirez's limp body threatening to spill into the abyss. Sarah pulled with everything she had left, veins bulging, teeth clenched until her jaw ached. Inch by inch, she dragged the stretcher back onto solid ground. When it was done, she collapsed onto her back, chest heaving, staring at the sky. Halle leaned over her, his face pale. "Ma'am, you can't keep this up." Sarah's eyes snapped to his, blazing. "Watch me." That night, as the wind howled through the canyon, Sarah allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. She thought of her father. He had walked through jungles in Vietnam, carried brothers on his shoulders through ambushes and artillery fire. As a child, she remembered his words. Pain is temporary. Quitting is forever. She whispered it now to herself, to Ramirez, to Hall. The words became a prayer, a mantra against despair. Pain is temporary. Quitting is forever. By the 12th day, Sarah's body was breaking. Her shoulders were raw from the stretcher straps, her knees swollen, her boots worn thin. Hunger gnawed at her, her stomach cramping from lack of food. But every time she faltered, she looked at the men she carried. Ramirez, still alive despite his wound. Halle, limping but fighting through agony. They were her responsibility, her brothers, her mission, and she would not abandon them. The march through hostile territory was not just a test of strength, it was a war of will. Each step was defiance. Each mile a message to fate itself. You will not have us. Not yet. And though Sarah knew command had already buried her with words on a page, she carried her men forward, rewriting the ending with every agonizing stride. Because heroes weren't born in medals or ceremonies. They were forged here in the silence of mountains, in the blood and sweat of survival, in the unyielding refusal to quit. And Sarah Whitfield was not finished. Not while her men still breathed. At the naval base overseas, life went on, or at least it pretended to. Orders still flowed. Helicopters still lifted from the tarmac at dawn. Soldiers still marched across the yard, with boots hitting the ground in perfect cadence. But beneath the surface, the air was heavy. Grief hung like smoke over the compound. The news had spread fast. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Whitfield and her team were gone. No survivors. The official report was blunt, sterile. Helicopter down in hostile territory. Search efforts terminated due to overwhelming enemy presence. Unit presumed lost with all hands. The kind of words that ended lives neatly on paper, even as real lives bled out on mountainsides. Admiral Foster read the report 3 times before setting it down on his desk. His face was stone, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. He'd known Sarah since she was a junior officer, all fire and fury, challenging every assumption, fighting for her men, even when it cost her political favor. She had been a rare kind of leader, and now she was just another file in the casualty log. His aide, Lieutenant Harris, entered with a stack of envelopes. "Sir, the condolence letters are ready." Foster nodded, though the motion seemed to drain him. He opened the top envelope. The words inside were the same as they had always been. Respectful, polished, and utterly lifeless. "It is with profound regret that I inform you." He read it twice before placing it back in the envelope. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Send them." Harris hesitated. "Sir, are we certain?" The Admiral cut him off with a sharp glance. "We are never certain, Lieutenant. But the families need closure, and the mission moves on." Harris swallowed hard, saluted, and carried the letters away. Closure. It was a cruel word. Back in Virginia, Sarah's mother sat at the kitchen table when the knock came. She knew before she opened the door. Every military mother did. 2 officers stood there in their dress blues, hats tucked under their arms. One carried a letter, the other a folded flag. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the doorframe for support. She didn't hear their words, didn't feel the hand that steadied her. Her eyes locked on the flag, and her heart shattered. At the base overseas, a memorial service was arranged. A podium was set in the courtyard, rows of chairs lined up neatly, a wreath placed beneath the flag. Soldiers stood in silence, their faces hard masks hiding softer truths. Captain Ruiz sat in the front row, his jaw clenched. He had fought beside Sarah. He had trusted her with his life. And now he was told to accept she was gone. Just like that. No body, no evidence, just fire in the mountains, and a report written by men who hadn't been there. As the chaplain spoke of sacrifice and honor, Ruiz's hands curled into fists. He wanted to shout, to demand they keep searching, to refuse this quiet surrender. But the system was larger than his voice. So he sat in silence, seething, while around him the base lowered its head. After the service, soldiers gathered in small groups, whispering. Some cursed the enemy. Others cursed command. But beneath their anger was something else. Doubt. Sarah Whitfield? One corporal muttered. She's not the type to just die. His companion shook his head. You saw the report. A bird goes down in that terrain. You don't come back. The corporal stared into the distance. If anyone could, it'd be her. The word spread like an ember in dry grass. Quiet, unspoken hope. Dangerous, maybe, but impossible to extinguish. Inside the command office, Admiral Foster stood at the window, staring at the mountains in the distance. Harris entered quietly, standing at attention. You disapprove, Foster said without turning. Sir? The letters, Foster clarified. You think we shouldn't have sent them? Harris hesitated. Permission to speak freely, sir? Foster nodded. I keep thinking about her. About the kind of officer she was. If anyone could survive that crash. Harris trailed off. Foster finally turned, his gaze sharp. Lieutenant, hope is a dangerous thing in this line of work. It clouds judgment. It keeps families from moving on. It keeps soldiers from focusing on the next mission. But sir, Harris pressed, voice tight, what if she's still out there? Foster's eyes hardened. And God help her. Because we can't. The words landed like a hammer. Harris saluted, turned, and left. But as he walked down the hallway, the thought refused to die. What if she's still out there? Meanwhile, in the mountains, Sarah was dragging Ramirez's stretcher through a dry creek bed, every muscle screaming. Hale hobbled beside her, sweat pouring down his face. Their bodies were broken, but their spirits refused surrender. Sarah's thoughts flickered, unbidden, to the letters. She knew how the system worked. By now, her mother had probably opened one. By now, the Navy had declared her gone. Let them think it, she told herself, teeth clenched as she pulled Ramirez another inch forward. I'll write my own ending. At the base, soldiers toasted her memory that night. Bottles clinked in the barracks. Stories of her toughness and humor passed from bunk to bunk. They spoke of her as if she were a ghost, half believing she might walk through the door at any moment. Captain Ruiz stayed silent, drinking alone. His eyes burned with a conviction he refused to voice aloud. She's not dead. I know it, but the official line was final. Sarah Whitfield was gone. The command had written her off. And so the world moved on, while in the unforgiving wilderness, she fought on, unseen, unheard, unbroken. Because sometimes the greatest battles are fought where no one is watching. And Sarah was still fighting. The human body was not built for this. By the 15th day, Sarah Whitfield's shoulders were torn raw from the straps of Ramirez's stretcher. The skin beneath her uniform was blistered and bloody. Her knees buckled with every step, and each breath felt like fire tearing through her chest. And yet she moved. Ramirez groaned faintly on the stretcher, delirious with fever. Hale staggered beside her, his broken legs splintered crudely with wood and parachute cord. His eyes were sunken, his lips cracked, but he forced himself to stay upright, one hand gripping the makeshift crutch, the other steadying Sarah whenever she stumbled. They were shadows of soldiers now hollow-eyed, starved, and battered. But they were still alive. And Sarah would not let death take them. Not yet. The mountains showed no mercy. On the 16th day, they reached a ravine split by a rushing river. The only crossing was a rickety rope bridge, swaying violently in the wind. Sarah stared at it, her gut tightening. It looked like it had been built decades ago, wood slats rotting, ropes frayed and sagging. "We can't cross that," Halle rasped. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said flatly. "The valley below is crawling with patrols. We'd never make it through alive." She tested the first plank with her boot. It groaned but held. Turning to Halle, she locked eyes with him. "You go first. One step at a time. Keep your weight low." He swallowed hard, nodded, and began his halting journey across the bridge. A structure creaked, swayed, but held. Then came Sarah's turn. She strapped Ramirez to her back, a dead weight nearly crushing her, and stepped onto the bridge. Each board creaked under the combined weight. The ropes groaned as if ready to snap. Below, the river roared, jagged rocks waiting like teeth. Halfway across, the wind picked up. The bridge lurched violently, nearly throwing her off balance. Ramirez shifted against her back, his weight threatening to topple her. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the ropes. "One more step," she whispered through gritted teeth. One more. By sheer willpower, she reached the far side, collapsing to her knees. Halle grabbed her arm, pulling her onto solid ground. They had made it, barely. That night, as they rested in the shadow of a cliff, Sarah spotted movement on the ridge. Enemy patrol. 3 figures, rifles glinting in the moonlight, scanning the rocks below. Her heart seized. They had been tracked. Sarah motioned for Halle to stay low. She dragged Ramirez behind a boulder, her pistol already in her hand. The patrol moved closer, voices carrying through the night. They were hunting deliberate, slow, patient. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. She only had 7 rounds left. If they found them, it would be a slaughter. The lead soldier paused, his eyes narrowing at the shadows. He raised his rifle. Sarah fired first. The shot cracked through the night, echoing across the cliffs. The soldier dropped instantly. The other 2 shouted, diving for cover. Bullets pinged off the rocks around her. Halle, despite his broken leg, grabbed a loose stone and hurled it at one of the soldiers, catching him across the temple. The man staggered, disoriented. Sarah put another bullet in him before he could recover. The last soldier charged, screaming, his rifle spitting fire. Sarah ducked, rolled, and came up firing. Her final round caught him in the chest. He dropped, silent. The canyon was quiet again. Sarah crouched low, chest heaving, pistol empty in her hand. Her body shook with adrenaline and exhaustion. Halle looked at her with wide eyes. "Ma'am, you saved us." Sarah shook her head, reloading with trembling fingers. "No, we just bought time." By the 18th day, Sarah was beyond exhaustion. Her body was a machine running on nothing but willpower. Every muscle screamed. Her vision blurred. But the thought of stopping never entered her mind. She had begun to hear her father's voice in the wind. "Don't quit, Sarah. Don't ever quit." Ramirez's fever broke briefly, and he whispered her name. That single moment of awareness fueled her like a spark to dry tinder. "Stay with me, Chief," she told him, gripping his hand tightly. "I'm getting you home." On the 19th day, they reached the edge of the mountain range. From the ridge, Sarah could see it at last, faint smoke rising in the distance. The base, salvation. Her knees nearly buckled at the sight. She had dragged her men across hell itself, and now they were almost home. But the final miles would be the hardest. The valley leading to the base was wide open, with little cover. If they were spotted, there would be no escape. Sarah gathered Halle and Ramirez close. "This is it," she whispered. "We move at dusk. Slow, steady, no noise. We're almost there." Halle nodded, determination etched into his gaunt face. Ramirez, half conscious, managed a weak smile. When the sun dipped below the horizon, they began their final push. Every step was agony. Every sound made Sarah's heart leap. Shadows seemed to move with hidden threats. And yet, with each painful stride, the smoke grew closer. The faint hum of generators reached her ears. The outline of guard towers came into view. The base. Home. Sarah staggered forward, Ramirez's stretcher digging into her flesh, high limping beside her. She didn't even remember falling, only the sudden shouts, the blinding beams of searchlights, the silhouettes of soldiers rushing toward them. Her last conscious thought before collapsing was simple, raw, unyielding. I brought them back. Because sometimes, survival isn't about strength. It's about refusing to fall, even when every part of you is already broken. And Sarah Whitfield had refused. The night was quiet at the Naval Forward Operating Base. A dry wind swept across the compound, rattling loose sheets of corrugated tin and carrying the faint smell of diesel from the generators. The guard towers stood watch, their spotlights slicing through the darkness, the soldiers inside half bored, half alert. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift. Then the silhouette appeared on the horizon. Private First Class Mason was the first to see it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, some stray animal wandering near the wire. But the shape moved differently, staggering, slow, urgent. He blinked hard, raised his binoculars, and froze. Jesus Christ, he whispered. What he saw wasn't one figure. It was three. At the front was a woman, tall, shoulders stooped under a brutal load. On her back, she carried what looked like a stretcher, the limp form of a man tied to it. Beside her limped another, barely upright, dragging one leg. Mason's hands trembled as he reached for the radio. Tower 3 to command. You need to see this. Someone's coming in. 3 figures. They look. He hesitated, voice cracking. They look like ours. The base erupted into motion. Floodlights snapped on, sweeping the ground outside the wire. Soldiers scrambled to the perimeter, weapons raised, eyes straining. A siren wailed once, then cut short as officers barked orders. At the gate, Captain Ruiz shoved past the guards, his heart hammering. He squinted into the glare of the searchlights. And then his breath caught. It couldn't be. But it was. Holy hell, he murmured. That's Whitfield. The gate clanged open. Sarah stumbled through, every step a battle. Her uniform was shredded, her face gaunt, streaked with dirt and dry blood. Her eyes burned with feverish exhaustion, but they were still sharp, still alive. On her back, Ramirez hung like a rag doll, his chest rising and falling faintly. Holly limped beside her, leaning heavily on a crutch made from a stripped tree branch. The base froze. Soldiers gawked, silent, as if afraid to blink in case the vision vanished. Sarah took 3 more steps into the courtyard. Her knees buckled. Ramirez's stretcher nearly slid off her shoulders, but Ruiz caught it just in time. She swayed, trying to speak. Her voice cracked, raw and broken. Brought them back, and then she collapsed. Chaos erupted. Medics rushed forward, lifting Ramirez from the stretcher, guiding Hal onto a gurney. Another team swarmed around Sarah, checking her vitals, calling out numbers in urgent voices. But even as consciousness slipped from her grasp, Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing Ruiz's sleeve. They're alive, she rasped. Don't let them. Ruiz knelt, gripping her hand. His throat tightened. You did it, Sarah. You kept them alive. We've got them now. Rest. You're home. Only then did she let go. Word spread across the base like wildfire. Men and women who had stood at her memorial 2 weeks earlier now crowded the medical bay windows. craning for a glimpse. The disbelief was universal, the shock electric. She walked in, one Marine whispered, carrying Ramirez on her back. I saw it. That's impossible, another muttered. Nobody survives out there that long. Tell that to Whitfield, came the reply. In the command office, Admiral Foster stood rigid as Lieutenant Harris burst in, breathless. Sir, you need to come. It's her, Whitfield. She's here. Foster's jaw tightened. That's not funny, Lieutenant. I'm not joking, sir, Harris said urgently. She's alive. Ramirez and Hawley, too. They just came through the gate. For a long moment, Foster said nothing. His face betrayed nothing. But his hand tightened on the desk edge until his knuckles went white. Finally, he said, Take me to her. When he entered the medical bay, the room fell silent. Sarah lay on a cot, 4 in her arm, her body a patchwork of bruises and bandages. Ramirez and Hawley were in adjacent beds, hooked to monitors, weak but stable. Her eyes fluttered open as Foster approached. For a heartbeat, soldier and admiral simply stared at each other. You were dead, Foster said at last, his voice low. I signed the letters myself. Sarah's lips cracked into the faintest smile. Guess she'll have to retract them. Despite himself, Foster almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone quiet but fierce. How? Sarah's gaze hardened. Because I don't quit. And neither do my men. The base erupted that night in celebration. Soldiers poured into the courtyard, cheering, clapping, slapping each other on the back. For days they had mourned. Now they witnessed the impossible. Ruiz lifted a glass of contraband whiskey. To Whitfield, he shouted. The one they couldn't kill. A roar of voices echoed back. To Whitfield. But Sarah, resting in the infirmary, heard none of it. She slept the sleep of the dead, her body finally surrendering after weeks of brutal survival. Back in Virginia, the knock came again at her mother's door. This time, the officers wore different expressions, sheer disbelief and barely contained joy. We were wrong, one said, his voice breaking with something close to awe. Your daughter is alive. Her mother wept, clutching the letter she had never been able to burn, now rewritten by Sarah's very existence. The next morning, Sarah awoke to find Ruiz sitting by her bed. His eyes were red, his uniform rumpled, but his smile was genuine. You scared the hell out of us, he said. Scared myself a few times too, she rasped. He shook his head. They were ready to bury you, Sarah. But you walked back in with your men. You rewrote the story. She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the weakness in her body. I told you. I don't quit. And across the base, across the Navy, across every home that had received a condolence letter, her name spread like wildfire. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as proof that sometimes the unthinkable could happen. Sarah Whitfield had returned from the dead, and the world would never forget it. The first thing Sarah noticed when she woke again was silence. Not the silence of the mountains, filled with whispers of wind and the distant echo of wolves, but the sterile quiet of the medical bay. Machines hummed softly, 4 bags dripped in rhythm, and the faint smell of antiseptic replaced the stink of blood and dirt she had carried for weeks. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the brightness overhead. Her body felt alien wrapped in bandages, stitched together, fragile. But she was alive. Ramirez and Hawley were alive. That was enough. Days passed in a blur of treatments and questions. Doctors marveled at the state of her body, malnourished, dehydrated, battered to the edge of collapse. Nurses whispered about the impossible distance she had crossed. And officers came, one after another, their clipboards filled with forms, their eyes filled with disbelief. Everyone wanted to know how she had done it. Sarah gave them the truth, though it sounded too simple for their liking. I walked. I carried them. And I didn't quit. That was all. No miracles. No secrets. Just grit and refusal. The story spread beyond the base. Within days, news networks back home ran her name across screens. SEAL officer declared dead returns alive with 2 wounded men. Headlines called her a miracle, a legend, a symbol of American resilience. But Sarah cringed every time she heard the word legend. She remembered the mud under her nails, the nights shivering in silence, the patrol she had killed with trembling hands just to keep her men breathing. There was nothing legendary about it. It had been ugly, brutal, and nearly fatal. And yet, the world wanted a hero. Admiral Foster came to see her again a week later. His expression was as unreadable as always, though this time there was something softer in his eyes. "The Secretary of Defense is requesting a debrief in Washington," he said. "They want to hear your account directly. There's talk of a medal. Maybe more." Sarah shifted on the bed, wincing at the pull of stitches in her side. "I don't want a medal." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Most people would. Most people weren't there," she said sharply. Her gaze hardened. "You know what I want? I want better reconnaissance, so no unit walks into an ambush blind. I want longer search windows before we declare people dead. I want Ramirez and Halle to get the care they need. That's all." For the first time in years, Foster's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "You haven't changed. Neither has the system," Sarah shot back. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood on crutches at a press conference. Cameras flashed like lightning. Microphones bristled on the podium. Behind her stood Ramirez in a wheelchair, pale but recovering, and Hall, his leg in a heavy cast, standing stubbornly on his own. The crowd hushed as Sarah spoke. "I've been called a hero," she began, her voice steady despite the fatigue etched into her features. "But I don't see it that way. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I did my duty. I refused to leave my men behind. That's not heroism, that's leadership." She paused, scanning the sea of faces. "The truth is, I survived because of them as much as they survived because of me. Halle fought through agony to keep moving. Ramirez held on when most would have let go. We didn't make it back because of me. We made it back because we refused to quit on each other." Her words cut through the room, raw and unpolished. Not a speech for headlines, but a truth for those who understood. And in the silence that followed, respect, not applause, not frenzy, but genuine respect settled over the crowd. Back at the base, Sarah returned to the barracks weeks later, still walking with a cane. The moment she stepped inside, the room erupted. Soldiers rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, their voices echoing off the walls. Ruiz was the first to reach her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "You stubborn, impossible woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You proved us all wrong." Sarah smirked faintly. "I told you I don't quit." Around her, soldiers repeated the phrase, some as a chant, some as a whisper. "I don't quit." It spread through the barracks like a battle cry. Weeks later, back home in Virginia, Sarah stood on her mother's porch. The same porch where the flag and the letter had been delivered weeks before. Her mother opened the door, eyes wide, hands trembling. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Sarah stepped forward, and they clung to each other, silent sobs shaking them both. "I thought I lost you," her mother whispered. "You almost did," Sarah admitted. "But I promised I'd come home." And now she had. Months passed. The scars on her body healed, though they never fully faded. Ramirez and Halle recovered, each carrying their own marks from the ordeal. Life began to move forward again. But for Sarah, something had shifted. The world had given her titles: hero, legend, miracle. She carried none of them comfortably, because she knew the truth. Heroism wasn't glory. It wasn't medals or speeches. It was choosing, again and again, not to surrender when surrender would have been easy. It was carrying someone else's weight when your own body was breaking. It was surviving the silence, the cold, the hunger, the fear, and walking one more step anyway. One evening, sitting alone outside the base, Sarah looked at the condolence letter they had given her mother. She had asked to keep it. The words were neat, polished, final. "It is with profound regret that I inform you." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her journal, not as a reminder of death, but as proof of defiance. The letter had written her ending. She had written her own. And so Sarah Whitfield lived not as a ghost, not as a legend carved in stone, but as a soldier who had shown the world the quiet, relentless truth of survival. That sometimes the difference between life and death is nothing more than the refusal to quit.